بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, it's so good to be here again, and we're going to be covering aspects of atheism, the LGBTQ plus ideology, and aspects of liberalism. Because of the time that we have, we can't go through all of atheism and all of liberalism, but I'm going to give you kind of some essential features of these false ideologies to empower you so you're able to navigate the modern ideological space. The first thing that I'm going to go through is atheism, but how? I'm going to be addressing the question, does science lead to atheism? Because generally speaking, that is one of the key motivations for many people leaving Islam or adopting an atheistic worldview, because they have a misunderstanding of science and the philosophy of science. And I want you to take notes, because I want to give you the principles of the philosophy of science, or certain key principles in the philosophy of science, in order for you to be able to address this question, which is, does science lead to atheism? So we're going to be addressing three key questions within the question of, does science lead to atheism? And the first question is, well, does science lead to the rejection of a transcendent creator? The other question is, does science lead to rejection of revelation or religion, the Quran? And the third question is, how to address certain detractions from atheists when they say that direct observations, not just scientific theories or conclusions, but direct observations, they go against the Quran. So I want to give you a case study and certain principles on how to deal with that too. So it's quite comprehensive. So when we complete this, we're going to have about a 10-minute break. Then we're going to come back and deal with LGBTQ+. After we finish the LGBTQ+, we're going to pray Salah, Isha Salah. Then after that, we're going to finish with liberalism and then have some Q&A. Sounds good?
Yes.
Alhamdulillah. So the first thing we need to do when we're addressing the question of does science lead to atheism, we need to first understand what on earth is science and what on earth is theism. And we don't have to do it in a very academic way. We just need the kind of essential logical summary of these two things. So when we deal with science, I don't want to get into the huge debate on the demarcation of science, what is science, what is not non-science. I don't have to go into falsification, a weak version or a strong version in terms of being a strong Popperian or a weak Popperian. I don't have to go into things like the null hypothesis and all of this stuff. It's irrelevant. For the purposes of this question, you just need to know the logical foundation, if you like, or the logical essence of what is science and what is theism. And the best way to do this is to refer to the atheist philosopher of science and mathematician Bertrand Russell. He said that science is the attempt to discover by means of observation and reasoning based upon it particular facts about the world and the laws connecting facts with one another. So what are the key things here? That you need to refer to observations, and science refers to that which you can observe, and then scientists reason over those observations to form certain conclusions. Those conclusions may be particular facts about the world and the laws connecting facts with one another. And this is echoed by Professor Elliot Sober, another atheist. He is a philosopher of biology, a philosopher of science, and he says, at any moment, scientists are limited by the observations they have at hand. The limitation is that science is forced to restrict its attention to problems that observations can solve. So science essentially restricts itself to observation. One would argue what or indirect observation. So that's science in a kind of very basic summary from the perspective of what we need to address this question. So what is theism, specifically Islamic theism? Well, it's very simple. We believe in an uncreated, eternal creator that is transcendent. Laysa kamithlihi shay. He is uniquely one. He is absolutely independent. He has no beginning, no end. He doesn't give birth, nor was he born, and there is no equal to him. This is basically at the 112th chapter of the Quran. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Say Allah is uniquely one. Allahu Samad. He is the absolutely independent. And you know the rest of the surah. He begets not, nor was he begotten, and there is no equal to him. In essence, we believe in Al-Khaliq. Okay? We believe in the creator of the heavens and the earth, and he is transcendent. Yes, we believe in more things, but from the perspective of does science lead to the rejection of a creator, this is all we need for now. Is this clear?
Yes.
Good. So how on earth does science lead to atheism then? Just based on this. Tell me. I want you to think now. We've defined the logical basis, if you like, of science, or the essential definition of science, which is it restricts itself to observations, direct or indirect. Theism believes in an uncreated creator that is transcendent, which means you cannot observe. Okay? If I create the table, I don't become the table. The table is distinct and disjoined from me. By greater reason, it's an a fortiori argument. We don't make analogies with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In Arabic, what's a fortiori? Min bab al-awla, right? By greater reason, Allah created the universe distinct and disjoined from the creator. Allah is transcendent. So just understanding these two things, how do we answer the question? Who could tell me? Put your hand up. Yes?
Like we can't see God, must mean that he doesn't exist.
No, that doesn't answer the question. But an empiricist might say, if we don't see God, it means he doesn't exist, which is a false argument because there's so many things that we don't see, but we believe to be true. But how do we answer the question? By understanding the basic definition of science, or the essence, or an essential aspect of science, and an essential aspect of theism, Islamic theism. Yes?
In science, we can make observations and conclusions from things that are related to each other. We can't see the hand on top of it that's guiding everything.
Good, very good. So that's basically the point. You can't move from a method that is restricted to observations and use that method and say, therefore, God doesn't exist, because it's outside of the method of science. Science restricts itself to that which refers to observations, right? That which observations can solve, indirect or direct observations. God, by definition, as we just discussed, is transcendent. You can't see him. You can't put him in a test tube or in a laboratory. So that method cannot directly reject a creator that is eternal, that is transcendent. It's beyond the scientific method, because scientific method can only deal with that which can be observed. Is this clear? Yes. So what science can do is what? Stay silent on the issue, or it could provide scientific conclusions or data that philosophers and theologians can use to either provide rational philosophical arguments against God's existence or for God's existence. But these don't become scientific now. They're called evidential arguments. They become philosophical. But science as a method can only really be silent if it's trying to even attempt to deny the creator, because its method is de-scoped, if you like. Because the method which relies on observation cannot deal about that which cannot be observed, cannot deal with the entity, being or thing that can't be observed. Now this doesn't now mean, oh, but Hamza, some people believe in ghosts and science can't really deny ghosts, the existence of ghosts, because it can't observe ghosts, therefore ghosts exist. No, that's not the logical flow of the argument. We're saying we could probably disprove ghosts for other reasons or prove them through other reasons. We're just saying the scientific method cannot directly deny that which cannot be observed. It doesn't now mean that which cannot be observed is actually true. There's a difference here. We believe in Allah's existence for philosophical reasons. For example, the contingency argument. You know, when you read in the books of Aqeedah, mumkin al-wujud, wajib al-wujud, we have very good, robust arguments. Okay? So I want to summarize this with a very good thought experiment. I want you to imagine me and you went for coffee. I wouldn't mind the tea or coffee right now. Hint, hint. So imagine me and you went for coffee and we had the amazing dudh pati. That is liquid gold, by the way. Yeah? Buffalo milk. So I remember once when Sheikh Haytham brought buffalo milk fresh from, I think, someone's farm. And we're really tired because we do events or whatever. I think I was just really tired. And I said, whoa, Sheikh, how did you get bull's milk? It was an accident. I think I said that to him and he started laughing at me. Anyway, so me and you will have dudh pati, okay? Dudh pati in Lahore in some coffee shop. And I said, brothers, I just seen this palace. It's an amazing palace apparently. It's only 15 minutes walk and it has 1,000 rooms. I'm going to go there, I'm going to check it out and I'm going to come back. And you're going to be like, okay, no problem. So I go to the palace, open the door and I see these 1,000 rooms, 1,000 doors. And they're all numbered, 1 to 1,000. So I go to the first door, door number 1. I open that door and what do I see in that room? I see tables, chairs, paintings, ornaments, flowers, the works, yeah? And I'm like, wow. I close the door, then I leave. I come back to you and I say, I saw the palace. You're like, okay, go on, tell me, what do you do? Well, I walked in, I saw the first room, all these amazing things in that first room. I closed the door and I came back. And you're like, why, Hamza? You should have checked out all the 999 rooms. It's like, and I say to you, what's the point? If there was something in the first room, it means there is nothing in the other rooms. Does that logically follow? No. Well, that's the logic of the atheists when they say science leads to atheism. That's what it is. Oh, I see this universe, this physical world, I observe all of these things, therefore, there's nothing outside of the universe. It just doesn't logically follow. And by the way, atheists appreciate this as well, by the way. Scientists appreciate this, even if they're atheist. It's just the kind of hardened atheist or the atheist that doesn't really understand the philosophy of science that actually makes these ridiculous conclusions. Is this clear? Okay. The other reason why they would argue that science leads to atheism from the point of view of the scientific method leading to the rejection of a uncreated transcendent creator, they conflate, which means they make the same, something called philosophical naturalism or metaphysical naturalism and methodological naturalism. Let me define these for you, okay? So, methodological naturalism is essentially a methodological criterion to assess or to allow you to understand what is deemed as scientific. So for a conclusion to be understood as scientific, it cannot refer to the supernatural. It cannot refer to God's divine creative agency. Okay? It doesn't mean God doesn't exist. They just say, look, it's a methodological criterion. We're saying that if this is a scientific conclusion, then it can't refer to God. It can only refer to the physical world or physical happenings. Okay? But it doesn't now follow in that God doesn't exist. And that's why the evolutionary biologist Scott C. Todd said, of course, the scientist as an individual is free to embrace a reality that transcends naturalism. In this context, philosophical naturalism. Okay? Now, philosophical naturalism is not a methodological criterion, it's a metaphysic, it's a worldview. It's the lenses that they put on their eyes to understand themselves and reality. And what do they say? As a starting point. This is how they view the world. Here are my lenses, or not mine, but the philosophical naturalist, or the metaphysical naturalist. There is no divine. There is no God. There is no supernatural. There is no non-physical. And everything can be explained by physical processes in a reductive or non-reductive sense. So what philosophical or metaphysical naturalism does, it entails atheism. because it's a metaphysic. It's a first principle. It's how they see the world. But methodological naturalism doesn't entail atheism. It's just a criterion to assess what is deemed as scientific. What they're doing is they make both the same. Is this clear? They conflate it. So they may say something like, oh, since science doesn't refer to God, or for scientific conclusions to be understood as scientific, they can't refer to God, therefore God doesn't exist. No, they're moving from methodological naturalism to metaphysical naturalism. But they're both not the same. And what's interesting is the way to see it is, think about driving. Think about a car. Just because I know how a car works, it doesn't mean the car wasn't made by someone. Simple as that. And that's what the atheist is doing here. Oh, we know how things work, and you don't have to refer to someone who made it, but we know how it works, and knowing how it works, I don't have to refer to who made it, therefore, there is no one who made it. This is with all due respect, it's bakwas. Yeah? Nonsense. It's bakwas on Burj Khalifa. Yeah, it's madness. So it's interesting. Hugh G. Gulch Jr. in his book Scientific Method in Brief, published by Cambridge, I believe, he says, he just summarizes what I've just said. Methodological naturalism contrasts with metaphysical or ontological naturalism that asserts natural entities exist, but nothing is supernatural as claimed by atheists. Hence, methodological naturalism does not deny that the supernatural exists, but rather stipulates it is outside of science's purview. Unfortunately, methodological naturalism is sometimes confused with ontological naturalism, which basically means philosophical or metaphysical naturalism. To insist that science obeys methodological naturalism and that science supports atheism is to get high marks for enthusiasm and low marks for logic. So the best that science can do is stay silent on the topic of trying to deny God. Or it could provide scientific evidence or data or theories or conclusions that theologians and philosophers can use to either prove God's existence or reject his existence. But those arguments are not deemed as scientific. They're called evidential arguments. They are philosophical arguments. Yes? Yes. So the Sheikh is asking to explain methodological naturalism one more time. Methodological naturalism is like a methodological criterion, and it basically says, in order for any conclusion to be understood as scientific, any theory to be understood as scientific, you cannot refer to the supernatural, you cannot refer to God's divine agency, you can't refer to creative agency of Allah, you can't refer to God in any way, and it's simple as that. But it doesn't now follow that God doesn't exist. Is this clear so far? I think we've solved the first part of this first presentation. Second part, which gets a little bit more complicated. Well, all right, Hamza, I agree. If you know science and you know theism well, science does not necessarily lead to the rejection of a transcendent creator. But what about religion? What about religion? Now, the first thing to understand is when you understand the philosophy of science, this is not going to be a problem. And let me explain to you. Most of the theories in science or the conclusions are based on the explanatory inference. And the explanatory inference can change. Your explanations can change. The explanation that you think is best can change. And the explanatory inference is usually referred to as the inference to the best explanation. So you may have competing explanations for the data at your disposal and the background information that you have, and you pick the best explanation that comprehensively explains the data, and it has greater explanatory power, explanatory scope, and so on and so forth. We don't have to discuss the criterion for best explanations, because even the scientists themselves, not the scientists in particular, but the philosophers of science, they have ikhtilaf, they have difference of opinion, whether or not the explanation should be simple or not, and so on and so forth. We don't have to get into that. All we need to get into is, well, the nature of the inference of best explanation is dhanni. It's the ilm that is dhanni, speculative. And let me explain why. Before I do that, I want to quote you Gillian Barker and Philip Kitcher in their book Philosophy of Science, a New Introduction, published by Oxford University Press. They summarize what I'm trying to say here. They say, science is revisable. Hence, to talk of scientific proof is dangerous because the term fosters the idea of conclusions that are graven in stone. There are no scientific Moses tablets. So, what do we mean by the inference of the best explanation? Okay. The inference of the best explanation is that you reason from one's data and background information to a theory or a hypothesis that explains the data, that best explains the data. And let me give you a funny scenario. Imagine my 11-year-old son. He wakes up at 3 in the morning and then he goes to the kitchen. He opens the cupboard, gets the cookie jar, climbs down from the cupboard, goes on the couch, opens the cookie jar, eats all the cookies, falls asleep, cookie crumbs all over his face. And I wake up in the morning and then I go to the kitchen. I check, there's no cookies. I want my cookies and milk. Where are the cookies gone? And then I see him on the couch, snoring, cookie crumbs everywhere. And the cookie jar right next to him and it's open. So I have some competing explanations here. But the best explanation is obviously, given the fact that I know some background information about my son, he loves cookies, he's a little bit cheeky, and given the data at my disposal, the crumbs, him sleeping, the cupboard was open, cookie jar next to me is empty, the best explanation is what? That my son ate the cookies or my wife? Son. Who? Son. Okay, now let's change something now. Before I see all of that happening, I open the drawer to put some socks on, and in the drawer, I see a doctor's letter that says, your son has an allergic reaction to cookies, and you can't give him these type of cookies, and it's the type of cookies that we have in the cupboard. And the doctor says the type of allergic reaction that he would have is his face will swell up and become really red. Okay, my wife didn't tell me, maybe I was busy, I was traveling. It's not life-threatening. I'll overlook this one. And then I stumble and I move the pillow and I see a little note. And it's my wife writing a note to my son, basically saying, make sure you wake up at 3 in the morning and pretend to get the cookies because I really want the cookies, but Papa doesn't allow me to have cookies because he wants me to be really healthy, yeah? Something like that. So now given the new information, right? And given the fact that I check near my wife and I also see some crumbs on her face, I've got some new data, new background information. What's the best explanation? My wife ate the cookies or my son? This is it. This is the inference of the best explanation. It can change based on new observations, new data, new background information. And this shows that it's probabilistic reasoning. It's dhanni. The ilm is dhanni here. It's based on probabilities and it can change. Even Charles Darwin said this himself in The Original Species. He says, I am well aware that there is scarcely a single point discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those at which I have arrived. Richard Dawkins says the same thing. The evangelical atheist, the evangelical Darwinist, in his book, A Devil's Chaplain. Do you know what he says? He says, we must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light, which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. But many of these, secular types and these Muslims, some of them with an inferiority complex, they think this is like Moses tablets. Even the evangelical atheists are saying it can change. And Professor Okasha, Samir Okasha, in his introduction to the philosophy of science, he summarizes how scientists use the inference to the best explanation. And he says, scientists frequently use inference to the best explanation. For example, Darwin argued for his theory of evolution by calling attention to various facts about the living world, which are hard to explain if we assume that current species have been separately created, but which make perfect sense if current species have descended from common ancestors as his theory held. So essentially, Darwinism itself is arguably an inference to the best explanation. Now, there are competing explanations, and there are criteria to assess which one is better than the other based on certain criteria in the philosophy of science. Some philosophers of science agree with these criteria, others don't. For example, the simplicity of an explanation, but we don't have to get into that. All we need to know is it's dhanni, it's probabilistic and speculative. Background information changes, data changes, inference can change. Is this clear? Good. The other principle I want you to know for us to answer this part of the presentation is just because a theory works, it doesn't mean it's true. Now, scientific realists, who are the majority of the scientists and the majority of the philosophers of science, which argue that well-confirmed scientific theories with predictive power, they represent reality. Scientific realists were motivated by the fact that science works. But they understood that there's no necessary link between science working and it being true. I mean, look, the sisters are watching this. The sisters know. They are masters at this principle. The sisters are the best philosophers of science from this perspective. Let's just admit it, brothers. Because sisters would say, Hamza, I totally agree with you. Just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. That's why I always tell my husband that he's always right. And our marriage works. But it doesn't follow that he's always right. May Allah bless our sisters who are devoutly obedient. Allahu Akbar. Chapter 4, verse 34. MashaAllah. Yeah? Do you see my point? Do you see my point? Just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. Anyone who's married knows this, right? And we know this, from the perspective of the history of science. In the history of science, we had a workable theory which was called phlogiston, and it argued that if you burnt something, it would release phlogisticated air. If it was combustible, it would release phlogisticated air. In 1772, Dan Rutherford used this workable theory to do what? To discover nitrogen. But then later we found out that phlogiston that was working was actually false. Science, the history of science is littered with these examples. Samir Okasha, the professor of the philosophy of science, he says, historically, there are many cases of theories which were empirically successful in their day, but later turned out to be false. In Evidence and Evolution, Professor Elliot Sober says, false models can sometimes work better than true ones. Just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. Third principle, and final one, to address the whole friction between religion and scientific theories. The third principle is understanding the epistemic status of scientific theories. What does this mean? The epistemic status means the truth status. Does it represent reality or not? Okay? And you have the scientific realist. As I said, scientific realism is the view that well-confirmed theories with predictive power, their predictions represent reality, the actual state of affairs. Instrumentalism says, no, well-confirmed theories with predictive power do not represent reality. They're just workable models that help us understand reality, in essence. Anti-realists say, well-confirmed theories with predictive power are not a representation of reality in any shape or form. They all agree that science can change, even the realists. They don't believe that scientific theories are infallible, they believe they're fallible. So they would say, if we have a well-confirmed theory with predictive power, we'll accept it to be true, we accept it to represent reality until we get future evidence. So they don't negate the fact that it can change in the future. So just understanding this, you know it's still dhanni, it can change in the future. So these three principles in the philosophy of science, the inference is the best explanation. If you get new background information, new data, the explanation can change. Just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. And the epistemic status of theories, irrespective of which one you take, the advocates still believe that science can change. Given these principles, then you should now know how to navigate between the Quran and any science if there's any friction. So if you have scientific theory X that opposes the Quran, then we don't reject the Quran and we don't reject X. What do? We accept the Quran always into our Aqeedah because it is definite from the point of view that we can prove it comes from Allah. Outside of the domain of science, we could have rational reasons for the Quran. And we believe that the Quran is from Allah and Allah is Al-Hakim, Al-Alim. He is the knowing, He is the wise. Allah has the picture of reality. We just got the pixel. So if there is any friction after you try to reconcile, it should never give you any doubts because you know this science is based on the inference of the best explanation. Even if it works, it doesn't mean it's true. And even if you're a scientific realist, you know it can change in the future. So it's dhanni. So why would it ever create a problem? But it doesn't mean you reject the theory either. You reject it creedally in your belief system, into your Aqeedah, but you accept it practically. There's nothing wrong with that. Because even if it's Darwinism, for example, I don't believe in it in terms of its implications or its kind of fundamental assumptions, but I'm accepting it practically because I know it's working in a certain domain, like discovering new antibiotics to save human life and so on and so forth. And I know just because it works, it doesn't mean it's true, but it's the workable tool that we have. I'm going to use it in order to do the science and even do science because I'm curious about how you could explain things within this particular framework, but I don't have to necessarily accept it in my Aqeedah because it contradicts the Quran, which is a representation of reality. Is this clear? So there's no need for like unnecessary reconciliation or like, crazy doubts. You just do an epistemic weighing, meaning truth value weighing. The Quran is like 10 out of 10 truth value. Scientific theories are like 8 out of 10 truth value. So why would there's no comparison. Do you see my point? This is basic epistemology. And that's why it would commit an epistemological disqualification if you're using scientific theories to deny the Quran. Because they're both different epistemologically. One's from Allah, one is from Allah and Allah knows everything. He's the creator of everything. And one is from a human and we know it's dhanni because the inference is the best explanation. We could get new background information, new data that can change the inference. Even Dawkins said this, even Darwin appreciated this. We know just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. And we know with regards to the scientific, epistemic state of scientific theories, realists, anti-realists, and instrumentalists, they all believe that science can change in some shape or form. So it's not a problem. So this answers the second part of the question, if there's any friction between scientific conclusions and theories and revelation. The last one, scientific errors. Now this doesn't really refer to scientific theories. It refers to really direct observations, which one would argue is not really a scientific theory. You won't even call it really a scientific conclusion per se. I like to call it just an empirical observation or a scientific observation. Now, even if you disagree with that, what I'm saying here is it doesn't require any sophisticated reasoning over lots of different data. Like in some parts of biology, you got a microscope, you saw it, you don't really need a theory to understand it. It's a direct observation. That's what I'm really talking about. So, some argue for the scientific errors narrative. They would argue that there are some direct observations we know to be true and we can't deny them, and they go against the Quran, therefore the Quran is wrong. Now, for the scientific error narrative to be true or to work, it has to show that what they're observing is true, and they have to show that every possible valid interpretation of the verse goes against it. But the argument I'm presenting here is there is not one case of a direct observation that goes against all of the valid interpretations. It is at least one valid interpretation that is aligned with direct observation. So the error narrative is false. And the scientific error narrative is really based upon three things, one of three things. Either they don't know the Quranic language, number two, they don't know the science, or number three, they don't know the Quranic language and they don't know the science. And I just want to give you a case study. Chapter 86, verse 5 to 7. And this concerns the so-called error where sperm comes from. So what does Allah say in the Quran in chapter 86 verses 5 to 7? Man should reflect on what he was created from. He is created from spurting fluid. Then he emerges, yakhruju, from between the backbone, the sulb, and the tara'ib. Okay? So here it says he emerges, which refers to the baby, but classically it could refer to both. And in the normative use of the language, it refers to the fluid. But it can still refer to both in classical Arabic grammar. So what's the contention? The contention is, the Quran says that the sperm comes from between the backbone and the ribs. This is unscientific because the testes, which where the sperm comes from, is not between the backbone and the ribs. So how do we address this? Well, the easiest answer is, well, Allah doesn't mention sperm. Allah is not mentioning the word nutfa, because nutfa linguistically means a minute drop of fluid from a greater quantity of fluid. Allah is mentioning fluid, ma'a, water, fluid. He's not mentioning nutfa. That's the first point to understand. However, even if Allah mentioned nutfa, even if this fluid refers to the sperm, it's still accurate. Why? Because when you go to the classical dictionaries that predated the modern scientific method, sulb doesn't just mean backbone. It actually means loins. And loins is anything you put your underpants on. And the testicles are that's the area, right? And tara'ib is ribs. And in the English language, what's defined as loins is anything below the rib cage and to the loin area. So what's fascinating, the Quran is completely accurate, even if you thought the Quran said sperm. Because the testes are between the loins and the ribs. Khalas. Game over. Now, let's go to valid interpretations. But before we do that, let's do some root word analysis. Yakhruju, to emerge. It comes from kharaja, to exit, to issue, to emerge, to come out, to leave. And it's used in Quran 30:25, 23:20, and 5:22. Sulbi, the root is sad, lam, ba. Loins and backbone. And this root is connected to the idea of something becoming rigid and hard. Keep that for later, for Maturidi's opinion that I'm going to discuss. Tara'ib. Ta-ra-ba. Collarbone, upper chest, ribs. Are we clear? So, there are three classical interpretations, which also are supported by modern interpretations as well. The first one is, the fluid itself comes between the backbone or loins and the ribs. This is the view of Ibn Kathir. And this is not problematic at all. The fluid comes from the prostrate gland, the testes, the seminal vesicles, and so on and so forth. And it's all within the loins and the back and the ribs. Perfectly aligned with direct observation. Second opinion. This is the opinion that I think Al-Qurtubi alludes to, and he refers to other people, I believe, as well. And the opinion of Ibn Aqeedah as well. And this is the opinion of the modern scholar, Professor Abdul Halim from SARS University. And they say, it doesn't refer to the fluid at all. It's actually the baby. Because you can't do that. Now, in normative usage of classical grammar, it should refer to the fluid. But the Quran doesn't always apply this rule. It can refer to the baby. And if you look at the theme of this surah, it actually makes sense as the baby as well. And this is a valid classical opinion, and it doesn't go against the grammatical rules of the classical Arabic grammar. Perfectly fine, because the womb is between the backbone, loins, and the ribs. Khalas. Aligned with direct observation. Now this one I prefer. Well, not prefer, but I like it. This is Maturidi's opinion. Actually, it's not his opinion, he cites other people's opinions. I think he cites someone called, let me find his name, Abu Bakr al-Assam. He says that the backbone, sulb, is an allusion, it's a kinaya for a male. You remember what it refers also to, in some linguistic way, something becoming hard or rigid? No offense, sisters. And he also argues that the breastbone, tara'ib, is a kinaya for women. And he says that this is supported by Quran 4:23 when Allah says, wives of your begotten sons. And so he argues this refers to males. Now, this is it's like balagha. It's a very beautiful way of indicating the sexual union between husband and wife. Because when they come together in intimacy, the fluids come from between them. Khalas. Aligned with what we know about the sexual union. So all three opinions of this verse align themselves with direct observation. But this shubha, this destructive doubt still exists online. It's insane. And many people don't know how to address it. You just have to get a basic dictionary. There are dictionaries that summarize the classical dictionaries. And you see the root word, you see the Quranic usage, and you also see how certain classical scholars viewed this term. And it wasn't just backbone, sulb, it was also meaning loins. And tara'ib obviously means the breastbone or the rib, and it can indicate women. So all of these things are completely aligned with modern observation. And this was a case study just to show to you that when they attack the Quran, they say, it's unscientific. Maybe it may not be aligned with one valid interpretation, but there are usually layers of interpretation from the schools, from the different books of tafsir, valid interpretations that align themselves with direct observation. The scientific error narrative falsely claims that this direct observation goes against all valid interpretations. And that's a false argument, because when you look into the Quran, you see that's not the case. And what these people usually do, they either don't know the language of the Quran, or they don't know the science, or they don't know the language, and they don't know the science. So this was the end of the first part of the presentation. So let's remind each other what we actually discussed. So, the discussion was about, does science lead to atheism? And the first thing we wanted to discuss was about the method of science, and does this method, using this method, can you deny an uncreated transcendent creator? And we said no, because science relies on observations. Allah is unobserved, He's transcendent. It's de-scoped. All science can do is stay silent on the topic or provide evidence that theologians or philosophers can use in order to do what? To provide arguments for or against God, but they won't be scientific conclusions. They're called evidential arguments, which are really philosophical arguments. Also, if they still claim that science leads to atheism, they probably do that because they conflate methodological naturalism with philosophical or metaphysical naturalism. And this is a false conflation, because one is a metaphysic, it's a starting point. They already deny God, deny the supernatural, and one is just a criterion to assess what is a valid conclusion, a valid scientific conclusion. Because for a conclusion to be deemed as scientific, you cannot refer to the supernatural or God, but it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. And they conflate both of these types of naturalism, because one already starts with the idea that God doesn't exist. One doesn't really talk about God. It just says, in order for a scientific conclusion to be scientific, it cannot refer to God's existence. The other section was, well, what about science denying or going against revelation of religion? And we went through three key principles in the philosophy of science. The inference to the best explanation. Just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. And we talked about the epistemic state of scientific theories, which basically echoing Gillian Barker, Philip Kitcher, Dawkins, Darwin, Professor Okasha, all of these people, that it's dhanni, it can change, we can have another observation that can contradict the current conclusions. And that's why even Dawkins himself said in A Devil's Chaplain that our successors of the 21st century may have new observations that deny Darwinism or modify it beyond kind of recognition. So when there is a friction between a theory and the Quran, then if you can't reconcile, then there's no problem. You still keep the Quran, because we have good reasons outside of science to prove that it's from Allah. And we know that the scientific method or its conclusions are dhanni, they're probabilistic in nature. And we know Allah has the picture, we just have the pixel. And we don't even have to reject the science, because if it's the best that we have, we can accept it practically, but not in our Aqeedah, because we know just because it's working, it doesn't mean it leads to a truth. Simple. Then finally, we said all about direct observations. Do they go against the Quran, the scientific error narrative? And we already discussed that's not true, because direct observations will not go against at least one of the valid interpretations in the books of tafsir. And usually the scientific error advocates, they fall for three things. Either they don't know the language, they don't know language of the Quran, they don't know the science, or they don't know the language of the Quran and the science. So these are key kind of, it's like usul, isn't it? Yeah? It's like the equivalent of usul al-fiqh from a scientific perspective. But it's true. So now you know this, you could apply these principles when you're mentoring people, when you're giving lectures or bayans, or when you're dealing with people like Hood Boy, or whatever the case may be. Or whatever the case may be. And what I suggest we do is, do you either want to take questions on this topic now and then have a break, or do a longer Q&A about everything? I suggest we do questions now on this topic, just for 10 minutes, then we'll have a 10-minute break. Then what we'll do is LGBTQ+, which will be great fun. And then after that, we'll pray Isha, and then we'll come back to deal with liberalism as well. So let's start with some questions. Please forgive me. I'm going to enjoy, which I believe to be liquid gold. Dud pati. Bismillah. First question.
If it's outside the scope, feel free to ignore it. But can you tell students a little bit about the response that we have to the atheistic argument about the burden of proof being on the theist, being on the believer? Because this is something that confuses people that, even if atheists cannot deny the existence of God, they say that the proof of proving the existence of God is on the believer.
Yeah, so the Sheikh was saying, what about the burden of proof? Because even atheists cannot deny God's existence. They'll say the burden of proof was on you. So there's two ways of addressing this. Fine, if they say the burden of proof is on us, then we just prove God's existence. And we have many arguments in the classical tradition. We have cosmological arguments, we've got arguments from design, we've got arguments from consciousness, we've got arguments from the ability to have rational insights, to formulate thoughts and judgments about things. We have the contingency argument, also known as the dependency argument. This is in the books of Aqeedah. But I don't like this approach. I believe the onus of proof is on men, because they're going against what you would call a self-evident truth. Now, a self-evident truth is a truth that is true by default. It can change, but by default, it's true. And the underlying logic of a creator is that a cause exists that is transcendent, or there are causes for things. And we believe in this uncreated creator. We're not talking about he's got names, attributes. It's the essential kind of logic underlying the essential aspect of what it means to be a creator. And that itself is self-evidently true, because they believe in self-evident truths. Like, for example, that the past was once the present. How do you know the past existed? How do you know that the past was once the present? It could be the case that the universe was created 3 seconds ago. It could be, but it was created with all of these memories and the fact that you've been living 30, 40, or 50 years. Why do we reject that? Because it doesn't make sense of our memories. It doesn't make sense of the temporal depth of time. It doesn't make sense of our psychological appreciation of time. And we accept it to be a self-evident truth that the past was once the present, right? And we know this because there are criteria for self-evident truths, right? They're not criteria. There are features of self-evident truths. They're not criteria, because we realize self-evident truths just by virtue of some of their features, if you like, conceptual features. One of these features include that it is universal. What does this mean? It doesn't mean everyone agrees with it. It means it's not contingent on social circumstances or specific locations, geographical locations, or cultures. It transcends culture, it transcends geographical location. So the idea of the past was once the present, you can't say this was a Kenyan idea and only Kenyans believe in this. No, everyone appreciates this. So it doesn't have to be universal that it's consensus or there's a majority. It basically means it's not the product of a specific society or ethnicity or culture. Second point, it's untaught. What does this mean? It means that you did not require any pedagogical source outside of yourself. It was internalized for your own introspection. No one taught me the past was real. I didn't go to school and the teacher said, you know what happened 10 days ago? It actually happened. This is nonsense. Right? And the final point is, it has to be simple and natural. Meaning that it's the product of a functioning psyche, and it actually comprehensively explains the phenomenon. It doesn't raise more questions than it solves. Because if I said, no, the past was once not real, we were created 3 minutes ago, doesn't explain temporal depth of time, psychological appreciation of time, my memories, it actually creates more questions than it solves. Like, how can this happen? How could everything exist as 3 minutes ago when we have historical artifacts, we have books, we have this, we have that? It's like a mass conspiracy, right? So these are the kind of key features of a self-evident truth. You could apply it to nearly everything. Even other minds existing. I can't really prove that you have another mind. I could prove you have a brain, but not another mind. I have a mind, I have a consciousness, but I can't really prove you have another mind. But there's a conceptual feature of this self-evident truth. It's universal, right? Everyone believes in other minds. It's not based on certain biological circumstances or an ethnic race or a particular social group. It transcends that. It's untaught. No one taught me that you have another mind. And number 3, it's simple and natural. It's based on my functioning psyche, and it explains my intuitions, explains my mind, explains the way you behave and talk to me. If I deny that you have a mind, then I have to somehow show that you're a zombie. How am I going to do that? It creates more questions, right? So that's a self-evident truth, that you have other minds. So they all believe in self-evident truths. But they deny Allah. They deny the basic concept of a creator. But that concept itself is a self-evident truth. Because the concept of things requiring a creator, a painting requiring a painter, a sculptor requiring a piece of, I don't know, what do you call it? A sculpture. Sculpture requiring a sculptor, yeah? It's like a tongue twister. These things are self-evident truths that you don't really learn. You don't teach children this painting had a painter, right? And it's untaught. It was universal because it is throughout different civilizations, ethnic groups and cultures. It's not the product of a specific culture or social biological circumstances. It's untaught. No one teaches you this, that a building required a builder, a painting required a painter, and so on and so forth. And it's natural and intuitive. Like even when you apply it to the universe, it makes sense. There was a creator for the universe, right? If you say there's no creator, then okay, well, how do you explain that? There's 4 more questions. Something came from nothing, this, that, and the other. Probability is bakwas. So I know this was a long way of answering the question, but I believe God's existence is self-evidently true in terms of the basic understanding of a creator or cause for things. So the onus of proof is on them. Because if someone were to challenge that you didn't have a mind, if someone were to challenge that the past didn't exist, or the past was not once the present, the onus of proof is on them, not you. Do you see? So that's how I would argue with them. Or get them to realize that, because then that gets them to become more kind of open-minded, and they would be in the position of saying, oh, he's got a point. There's so many things I believe to be self-evidently true that I don't even have any much justification for. And if someone were to deny them, I'm not going to prove them because I believe they're self-evidently true. I would say to them, you prove it. Likewise with God, with the Creator. All right, next question. Make it on the topic though. So, yes.
I think one of the reasons that things got really complicated was with modern physics evolving and giving theories like, for example, when we talk about atom, they say that you got a normal intuition can't really think about how an atom works. Or for example, the theory of multiverse and all of that. Because of those theories, you can't really, they say that your normal intuition or how a normal brain works doesn't actually explain how the universe works at abstract levels. So they say that, for example, saying that a painting requires a painter, that doesn't work in physics a lot of times when antimatter and matter, they come together and
Yep.
they spontaneously form stuff.
So what's the issue?
The issue is that confuses a lot of science avid readers, because they think that if all of that is possible, then the scientists say that maybe something coming from nothing is also possible. It's against intuition, but intuition never always explains.
I agreed. We're not saying intuitions are always true. we're saying if you have an intuition that hasn't been negated by observations or any other valid way of thinking or any other valid source of knowledge, then you stick to your intuitions because those things are self-evidently true. So I believe you have another mind. I don't know you have another mind. If science were to prove that you didn't have another mind, hypothetically, right? Then fine. I've got evidence now that changes my self-evident truth. Because as I mentioned, self-evident truths are true by default. And they're not necessarily just intuitions. Because self-evident truths are not just intuitions. Self-evident truths have certain conceptual features, as is mentioned, universal, untaught, natural, and simple. Yeah? Not all intuitions are like that. Do you see my point? So that doesn't really negate what we've just said. Also, it doesn't negate about how science leads to atheism, because all science deals with is observed. So, fine. It's just talking about things that they observe, no problem. That doesn't negate the fact that there is an uncreated creator. It's just telling you how the world works, okay? Matter, antimatter, this, that, and the other, no problem. Now, the whole idea of something coming from nothing, no scientist believes in that. Not one. Unless you define nothing in a particular way. So if they define nothing as, for example, the removal of physical time and space, and you just have this quantum reality, well, that's still something. They still say it's something physical. It's not nothing in terms of no thing, no prior causal condition, no property. They don't make that claim. Not one scientist makes that claim. So it's basically what they're saying is something comes from something. And all of that just doesn't negate the scientific... it doesn't negate the fact that there is a uncreated transcendent creator. Do you see my point? It may now start to suggest that, you know, there are some bizarre things that are happening in this universe and we can't explain everything properly. Fine, that's not a problem. This was Razi's view anyway. Razi was accused of doing a lot of science in his tafsir, but if you look at his exegesis of Surah Al-Fatiha, for example, he makes a really good argument. It says, look, Allah is referring to these natural phenomena to say that only Allah knows what's really going on in the universe. You're just there just to find out try to find out how Allah manifests His irada and qudra. So you affirm your ignorance and you affirm His perfection, right? Yes, He would relate to the modern things of the time, but from that context. So these are all beautiful things. But we have to be careful sometimes because scientists are not like, prophets that come down and give you objective truths. Scientists have their own problems. They're human. They have biases. There's something in the philosophy of science called theory-ladenness. Like you already believe a theory to be true and you read your theory into the data. You have this. And that's where they like to say, oh, something can come from nothing. You'll even have popular articles like that. But when you scratch the surface, you're like, okay, it's not nothing. It's not the philosophical nothing. No thing at all, no property, no prior causal condition. It's still something. Even Lawrence Krauss in his book, A Universe from Nothing, he admits that himself. He says, nothing is something physical. The reason he called it nothing, because he made the false point, the false assertion, that classically nothing meant no time and space. In physics, when you remove physical time and space, you still have something, but he's called that nothing now because it aligns with what he thinks is the philosophical nothing, but that's nonsense, he's misunderstood it. Because the philosophical nothing is no thing at all, irrespective of time and space. No property, no prior causal condition. So when people say in science something from nothing, they're just basically saying something from something. Is that clear? Alhamdulillah.
As you talk about the Zani, that we can call that like the direct observation. Sometimes the direct observation is so accepted in the social groups that it is, for example, if it contradicts the Quranic teaching, then we like in terms of internally we try to accept that direct observation. As you talk about the yakhruju min bayni sulbi wa ta'ib example. So my question is, how can we, for example, to contemplate on the Quran at that level? For example, you talk about the root words, and the dictionaries and all of that. It needs lots of time.
No. I am miskeen. I am not a scholar. I am not a student of knowledge. I'm a student of knowledge. And I could derive this stuff. You just need motivation. You pick up dictionaries, you go to the ayah, you find the root word, and you just write it down. Once you've written it down, you see all the relevant meanings, then you may open Ibn Kathir, Tabari, Qurtubi, Maturidi, and so on and so forth. You could even find these things online. And you go to that particular verse and you just find out what are all the valid opinions. Okay, it summarizes his opinion. His opinion is X. His opinion is Y. Then you look at all of them. Then you look at what the science says. And you say, okay, this one's okay. This one's okay. This one's okay. Khalas. You could do it in 10 minutes. It just sounds complicated, but it's actually not. In actual fact, we should do it together. We should pick one and just do it and just solve a problem. Like, really, it's not an issue.
For example, those students who are studying the Arabic language, they know it is easy. But for the mass people who are away from Arabic language, they're afraid of.
That's why it's your job to teach others. It's your job to provide these answers. It's your job to provide the solutions. Like, you can't expect the awam to know this stuff. But imagine you did a khutbah on this to the students at university. Yeah, God forbid you do that, yeah? Yeah, God forbid we do a khutbah that makes sense to people, yeah? You know what I mean? Like, maybe not even a khutbah, a bayan. Like, I was in South Africa with the Deobandi ulama. We trained about 500 ulama. We did lots of bayans. And it's better, really, because you get longer time. Like, cause sometimes the khutbah is 5 minutes. The bayan could be like half an hour. You got some juicy time there. You could talk about so many things. So do a bayan. Do a bayan on today we're addressing science and religion. Wow. Youth are there, parents are there. You give them some of these principles. You could do over a series of time and record it. Part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. Then go into all of these things. Nothing's stopping you. Anything stopping you? Ikhlas. Sometimes we need this conversation to unveil our blind spots with like, how am I going to do this? What am I going to do? But it's so possible. So possible. Like even, when they have the flat earth thesis, some people say there's a flat earth thesis in the Quran. The beauty of the Quran is it's multi-layered. So if you wanted to read the flat earth, you probably could. If you already believed in the flat earth thesis. But if you believe in a round earth, you could definitely read it into the Quran as well. Like we had the likes of Ibn Hazm, who predated the modern scientific method, said the world is round. Ibn Taymiyyah cites someone from the early generation, Ibn Munada, who says the world is round. I think even Al-Ghazali said, he's quite aggressive on the ones who didn't really believe the world is round. I think he called them fools or something. But yeah, even Al-Ghazali had that view as well. It's part of our tradition because the Quran is indicative of that position as well. Okay? With the alternation of the night and day, the takwir, which actually if you look at the root, if you look at the word in the classical dictionary, it's a turban. It's like putting a turban around a round head. The alternation of the night and day is like that. Putting a turban around a round head. I mean, that's fantastic. Do you see my point? So there's all these things that you could easily refer to. You just need to have the motivation, the vision, and just spend some time. That's all you do. Yeah?
Take one question that you mentioned that we have to have the Aqeedah that Quran is true, and yet we can have that the science is true as well.
No, it's not true. It's practical. So you want if it goes against the Quran, you want to accept it as true, but you accept it practically.
But don't you think that our iman is at stake when we say that Aqeedah, then I believe that Quran is the true word, but yet this might be working for me as well.
Yeah, working is different from it being true because we already discussed the principle in the philosophy of science. Just because it works, it doesn't mean it's true.
But iman.
No, why would it?
We build our iman on asbab and things.
Yeah, but this is not necessarily asbab in that way. This is more like an interpretation of the asbab. There's a difference. Because scientific theories are like explanations of the asbab or explanations of the physical things that we observe. Do you see? Because take evolution. Evolution, technically speaking, is biological change. Darwinism is the explanation that explains biological change. We're not denying evolution. We see biological change. We're not denying these asbab, if you like. We're just basically suggesting that this explanation may not be absolutely true for certain reasons. There's a subtle difference, yeah? Don't conflate theories with asbab, yeah?